Of course. Here's Section 1. Follow your instructions. Clear, focused, rich vocabulary. Every sentence advancing the plot or deepening character understanding. Within about 1,500 words. No unnecessary elements. No headings. The wind howled like a wounded beast across the frozen valley, tearing at Commander Alara Vance's exposed skin even through the reinforced layers of her thermal suit. Ice crystals gathered along the seams of her helmet, obscuring her vision and forcing her to wipe them away with numb fingers. She staggered forward, each step a desperate, grinding effort against the rising drifts. The transport ship was a black dot on the horizon now, shrinking, vanishing into the snowstorm that had come without warning. She was alone. Her breath hissed in shallow bursts inside the helmet, clouding the visor. A red warning blinked steadily on her forearm monitor. Core temperature falling. Immediate shelter required. She gritted her teeth, refusing to panic. Panicking was for people who had the luxury of failure. She tapped at the monitor, cycling to the dwindling readouts. Battery reserves near empty, atmospheric pressure stable, but falling temperatures predicted overnight. If she didn't find a solution before the next blizzard surge, she would freeze alive. The mission had seemed so straightforward back at the orbital station. Survey the unexplored ice world, catalog its resources, and report back. No one had expected the planet's surface to harbor life. No one had predicted the storm systems that could shred a ship's hull like paper. Now Alara trudged through a landscape of impossible beauty and lethal indifference, feeling the weight of every decision pressing against her spine. The canyon walls rose up like frozen cathedrals, their jagged icicles dripping slowly under the anemic sun. Amid the shimmering frost, movement caught her eye. Lumbering figures, pale as the snow around them, moving in slow, deliberate rhythms. She dropped instinctively to one knee, her pulse hammering. The creatures were unlike anything in the colonial archives. Towering masses of shaggy white fur, powerful limbs built for endurance rather than speed, dark eyes glinting with unsettling intelligence. They moved with strange grace, gathering around shallow pits they dug into the snow, curling their massive bodies into nests of ice. Alara forced herself to watch, to observe instead of react. The creatures, 6 of them in view, seemed utterly uninterested in her presence. They were preparing, she realized, for hibernation. One creature pawed at its thick coat, pulling loose strands of silvery fur and letting them drift into the air like seeds. The others did the same, a lazy, communal shedding ritual. The tactical part of her mind began to calculate. She could not survive in her current suit much longer. The material was designed for hostile planets, but not for temperatures that dropped to -90 by midnight. She needed insulation. She needed something better than what human technology could offer. She needed that fur. A wave of nausea churned in her stomach. Not from the cold, but from the enormity of the thought. Could she even approach them? Would they attack? There were too many unknowns, yet standing still guaranteed death. Carefully, deliberately, she lowered herself into the snow, trying to make her body appear small, non-threatening. The nearest creature glanced up, regarding her with solemn, unblinking eyes, then returned to pawing at its den. Heart-hammering, she detached a ration pack from her belt and tossed it gently into the snow halfway between them. It skidded across the crust, coming to rest a few meters away. Minutes dragged by. The creature sniffed the air, then lumbered forward on 4 massive limbs to investigate. It pawed at the packet, grunted, then sat back with an almost thoughtful air. Another creature ambled closer, curious. Within moments, the pack was forgotten, and the creatures resumed their slow, meticulous work. Alara exhaled shakily, not aggressive, then curious, perhaps cautious. She could work with that. Painstakingly, she inched forward toward a cluster of molted fur caught on a jagged ice formation. Her hands trembled as she gathered the wispy clumps, tucking them into a sample bag. The texture was astonishing. Soft as silk, yet impossibly dense, resisting compression. Perfect insulation. Hope, fragile and burning, flared in her chest. By the time she retreated to a safer distance, she had secured enough fur for preliminary tests. It wasn't enough for a full suit, but it was a beginning. The sun dipped lower, staining the horizon a bruised violet. She needed shelter before dark. Scanning the canyon walls, she spotted a shallow alcove shielded from the worst of the wind. It would have to do. She set up a crude workstation there, her hands stiff with cold as she unpacked the portable sewing machine salvaged from the transport's wreckage. A relic, but reliable in a way digital tools often weren't. The fur resisted traditional stitching. It slid and tangled, refusing to cooperate. Frustration mounted as a cold gnawed at her fingers, turning them clumsy and slow. Her first attempts yielded little more than a tangled mass. She bit back a scream of frustration, breathing deeply, forcing herself to think. Patience, observation, adaptation, the same principles that had brought her this far. She adjusted the machine's tension, experimented with hand stitching where the machine failed, layering the fur in overlapping strips like natural scales. Gradually, patterns began to emerge. Crude but functional, a patchwork of life-saving warmth. The creatures settled deeper into their nests, their movements slowing as the air grew colder, denser. Soon they would be completely dormant, unreachable. Her window of opportunity narrowed with every heartbeat. Another warning flashed across her monitor. Battery critical. External power required. She cursed under her breath. No backup power cells. No chance of recharging in this frozen wasteland. The machine would die within the hour. She worked faster, abandoning finesse for necessity. Every stitch was a battle against her own failing body. Her breath rasped painfully. Her fingers bled where the needle bit too deep. Still she pressed on, driven by the primal certainty that stopping meant death. At last, she had fashioned a rough tunic, thick and heavy but warm the moment she draped it over her failing suit. Relief swelled in her chest, bringing tears she didn't have the energy to wipe away. The first gust of true night wind howled through the canyon, a beast cry promising death to the unprepared. Ilera huddled deeper into her alcove, clutching the fur-lined garment to her chest. Feeling warmth returned to her limbs, faint but undeniable. Above her, the stars emerged, hard and cold and beautiful. Somewhere beyond them, her crew might still be searching for a way to rescue her. She couldn't know. She could only survive. The creatures settled into silence, their massive forms half buried in the snow, breathing in slow, synchronized rhythms. A strange peace settled over the canyon, fragile and immense. Ilera closed her eyes, listening to the ancient heartbeat of the frozen world, and knew that tomorrow she would do more than survive. She would find a way to live. Would you also like me to go straight into Section 2 in the same style, or would you like a brief recap or tweak first? Here's Section 2, carefully built to match your instructions. Clear narrative, focus on advancing the story and character, about 1,500 words, rich vocabulary, no unnecessary elements, no headings. Morning broke reluctantly, a pale smear across the endless sky, offering no real warmth. Ilera stirred beneath her makeshift cloak, muscles aching from the bitter night. The alien fur had saved her life, of that she was certain, but it was only a stopgap. She needed a full suit if she was to have any real chance at survival. And for that, she needed more fur, more than she could gather without risk. The creatures slumbered on, their massive bodies barely stirring under thin layers of drifted snow. They looked almost peaceful, ancient, as if they had existed here long before humanity ever learned to sail the stars. Watching them, Ilera felt a growing sense of respect and unease. Every choice she made now walked a tightrope between survival and violation. Taking their fur without permission, even shed fur, felt dangerously close to theft. But morality blurred when life clung by a fraying thread. She crouched at the edge of her alcove, scanning the ice fields for signs of disturbance. The wind had smoothed the ground overnight, burying her footprints. No predators had come. No unknown dangers lurked. Only the patient, enduring cold. Ilera moved carefully toward the nearest creature, her breath tight in her throat. The air crackled around her, dry and brittle. Each step left shallow impressions that glittered in the weak light. She paused, watching for any sign that the creature sensed her approach. It remained still, a low rumble vibrating through its chest with each exhale. The alien's fur, she now saw, was layered in astonishing complexity. A dense undercoat of fine fibers trapped warmth close to the skin, while longer, hollow strands deflected the wind. Nature had perfected a technology humanity could only dream of replicating. She reached out, heart pounding, and plucked loose a clump of molted fur from the snow near its massive paw. The creature shifted slightly, and Alara froze, barely daring to breathe. Its dark eyes opened, meeting hers with slow, deliberate blink. She stayed still, her body aching with tension. The creature sniffed the air, then made a soft, throaty sound, a noise that, strangely, did not seem threatening. It closed its eyes again, resettling into slumber. Alara retreated slowly, her prize clutched to her chest. Relief flooded her body, leaving her legs weak. She returned to her alcove, hands shaking not from cold this time, but from the adrenaline crash of having been seen and inexplicably accepted. The hours passed with painful slowness. She worked tirelessly, stitching and layering the fur into panels that could eventually be fashioned into a full suit. Her hands moved with increasing surety, adapting to the material's quirks. She learned to recognize the way the strands interlocked naturally, how the fibers could be woven rather than merely stitched, creating a stronger, more flexible structure. As she worked, her mind turned over possibilities. These creatures had adapted perfectly to their environment. Their biology was not just a curiosity, it was survival incarnate. If humanity could understand them, study them without exploitation, perhaps this world could become more than a frozen tomb. Perhaps it could offer lessons vital to colonization efforts elsewhere, but survival came first. Philosophy could wait. The cold gnawed at her whenever she paused, a constant reminder that time was her enemy. The fur she had collected was enough to fashion a torso covering and partial leggings, but she would need more for complete protection. Each venture closer to the sleeping giants carried more risk. They stirred more frequently now, their internal rhythms responding to the subtle shifts in temperature and light. On her third trip to gather fur, disaster nearly struck. As she bent to collect a particularly large clump near one of the larger creatures, its massive head lifted, deep-set eyes, dark and liquid, fixed on her. Alara froze, instinct screaming at her to flee. But something in the creature's gaze held her, a patient, almost curious consideration. Very slowly, she opened her gloved hand, showing the tuft of fur she had gathered. She placed it gently on the ground between them, and backed away a step, palms raised. The creature's nostrils flared, and for a long, agonizing moment, it simply stared. Then, to her astonishment, it reached one thick arm toward its own chest and scratched vigorously, dislodging a fresh clump of fur. The strands floated down like snowflakes. The creature watched her, waiting. Tears stung Alara's eyes, blurring the frozen world. She stepped forward and gathered the offer fur with hands that trembled with something beyond cold. She pressed her hand briefly to her chest in silent gratitude, then backed away slowly, never turning her back. Back in her shelter, she sobbed quietly, not from fear or exhaustion, but from the overwhelming, impossible kindness of a being she barely understood. She worked with renewed determination, every stitch a prayer of survival, every knot a whispered promise not to squander the chance she had been given. Days, or what passed for days on this slow-turning world, bled into each other. The sun never rose far above the horizon, casting the ice fields in perpetual twilight. The creatures grew increasingly sluggish, slipping deeper into hibernation with each passing cycle. Alara raced against their retreat, gathering fur only when absolutely necessary, never pushing the fragile truce they had built. She adapted, too. She learned to watch the sky for signs of oncoming storms, to build reflective walls of ice to trap the scant warmth her body generated, to ration every movement to conserve energy. The fur suit took shape piece by piece, an awkward, heavy garment that transformed into something magnificent with each addition. When she first donned the near-complete version, it was like stepping into a second skin. Warmth blossomed against her frozen limbs, a warmth so profound it brought her to her knees in gratitude. Still, survival was not guaranteed. Her food supplies dwindled dangerously, and the battery in her locator beacon flickered ominously. Rescue was a hope so faint it barely qualified as a dream. She was not merely surviving now. She was preparing to endure for the long haul. On the eve of what she calculated to be her sixth local day on the ice world, Ilara sat by her sewing station, patching a final seam on the outer shell of her suit. The creatures lay motionless in the field, fully enveloped in their icy nests. Snow coated their forms in a delicate crust, blurring the lines between living beings and frozen terrain. She rose to her feet, the suit creaking softly with the movement, and walked to the edge of the alcove. The sky stretched above her, a vault of glittering stars unmarred by atmosphere or light pollution. For the first time since her stranding, she allowed herself to feel something beyond fear or determination. She felt awe. The aliens had given her a chance, not out of obligation or pity, but from some instinctual wellspring of generosity. She was not sure she could ever repay it, but she could honor it by surviving, by living fully, by finding her way back to the stars and telling their story. Tomorrow, she would set out for higher ground, where the locator's signal might pierce the endless white sky. Tomorrow, she would stake her claim not as a conqueror of this world, but as a witness. Here's Section 3, carefully crafted to fit your instructions. The climb to higher ground was harder than Ilara had anticipated. Her new suit insulated her well enough from the cold, but the terrain fought her every step. Jagged ice ridges jutted like frozen waves, treacherous and sharp. Beneath the fragile surface, hidden crevasses yawned like mouths waiting to swallow the unwary. She moved with deliberate caution, testing each foothold before committing her weight. Every slip, every stumble sent shocks of terror racing up her spine, but she pressed on, driven by the simple, stubborn will to be seen, to be found. Above her, the sky was a deeper blue now, the stars dimming as the pale sun clawed a little higher. She checked the locator beacon strapped to her belt. Its light was steady if weak, a fragile heartbeat against the endless cold. She needed elevation, needed a clear line to whatever satellite still orbited this forsaken place. Every step upward was a bet against the planet's indifference. The creatures, her silent benefactors, lay far behind now, tucked safely into their hibernation nests. Ilara felt their absence acutely, a strange loneliness gnawing at her. In their quiet companionship, she found an unexpected sense of belonging, however fleeting. Out here, among the shattered glaciers and screaming winds, she was truly alone once more. Hours blurred into one another. She rationed her energy fiercely, stopping only when her legs threatened collapse. During one brief respite, she sat with her back against a jet of ice, pulling her knees to her chest to conserve warmth. Her gloved hands trembled slightly, not from cold this time, but from the sheer exhaustion of fighting a world that wanted her erased. Memories of Earth's surface unbidden. Warm sunlight filtering through green trees, the clatter of a crowded market street, the familiar buzz of voices, of life. She had come to the stars seeking adventure, meaning, perhaps even redemption. She had not expected survival to be the hardest, purest thing she would ever fight for. The locator beacon gave a weak chirp, startling her from her reverie. She fumbled it from her belt with clumsy fingers, heart leaping. The signal strength had spiked, faintly but undeniably. She staggered her feet, scanning the ice horizon. A peak loomed not far ahead, its summit catching the thin light, like a shard of broken glass. That had to be it. That had to be her chance. The final ascent tested every ounce of her strength. The wind shrieked against her body, clawing at her with invisible fingers. She anchored herself with her battered boots, leaning into the slope, driving forward one agonizing step at a time. Her breath fogged inside her hood, freezing instantly against the fur lining. At last, she reached the summit, a narrow ledge of ice overlooking a vast, broken expanse. She knelt, struggling to catch her breath, and raised the beacon high above her head. Its light pulsed, slow and steady. She could only hope that somewhere above, a receiver would catch her signal, that someone would realize she was still alive. She settled against the ice, letting the cold seep into her bones now that the battle was momentarily over. As she sat, a strange sensation prickled at the back of her mind, the feeling of being watched. She turned slowly, half expecting to see one of the hibernating giants somehow awake and following her. But there was nothing, only the endless, shifting snowscape. Except there was movement. Far below, a dark shape slithered across the ice, weaving between shattered ridges with unnatural grace. It was too distant to make out clearly, but something about its movement set her nerves jangling. It did not move like the great hibernating creatures. It moved with purpose, with hunger. Illyra's mouth went dry. She pressed herself lower against the ice, pulling her fur cloak tighter. Instinct screamed at her to move, to flee, but logic told her she had nowhere to run. If the creature, whatever it was, had not yet seen her, she would be wise to keep it that way. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching taut with fear. The shape disappeared behind a ridge, and for a time she dared to hope it had moved away. But the feeling of being hunted clung to her, as persistent as the cold. She could not stay here forever. If rescue did not come soon, she would have to find a way to defend herself, or die trying. Night fell with a terrifying suddenness. Without the faint sunlight, the landscape transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and silvered ice. She huddled beneath her cloak, barely daring to breathe. Every crack and groan of the glacier felt magnified, a whisper of unseen threats shifting in the darkness. At some point, she could not have said when, she heard it, a low, almost inaudible rasping, like claws dragging across stone. Closer than before. Much closer. Heart-hammering. Illyra reached into her supply pack, fingers fumbling for anything that could serve as a weapon. All she found was a heavy sewing needle she had used to stitch her suit, its point dull by use. It was laughable, pathetic, but it was something. The rasping came again, louder now, accompanied by the soft crunch of snow underfoot. She peered over the edge of her cloak, pulse pounding in her ears. The creature emerged from the darkness, a silhouette more nightmare than animal. It was lean where the giants had been massive, sinewy, and coiled with tension. Its hide shimmered in the moonlight, a patchwork of scales and matted fur. Eyes like molten coals scanned the ice, seeking. Illyra shrank back, willing herself to be invisible. The creature's nostrils flared as it sniffed the air, and a low, rattling growl escaped its throat. It moved with a predatory certainty, circling closer. The locator beacon lay just beside her, still emitting its faint, rhythmic pulse. Too faint, she realized too late, to mask her scent or her heat signature. The creature was homing in. Every instinct told her to run, to bolt blindly into the night. But she forced herself to stay still, calculating desperately. If she moved now, she would die. If she fought, she would die. Her only hope was to be beneath the creature's notice, to be as insignificant as a snowdrift. The creature prowled within meters now, head low, breath steaming in great gusts. It paused, tilting its head, and Illyra hoped it might move on. But fate was not so kind. With a sudden snarl, the creature lunged. Illyra reacted without thinking, jabbing upward with her makeshift weapon. The needle struck the beast's muzzle with a wet sound, startling it into a furious retreat. It howled, thrashing wildly, scraping great gouges into the ice. Seizing her chance, Illyra rolled to her feet and ran. The glacier blurred around her, a nightmare of jagged edges and shifting ground. Her lungs burned with the effort. Behind her, the creature shrieked in fury, the sound echoing endlessly across the frozen expanse. She dared not look back. She ran until her legs buckled, until the cold seemed to tunnel into her very marrow. She stumbled into a narrow crevice and collapsed, pressing herself into the shadows. Hard in her throat, she listened for the beast's pursuit. Minutes passed. An hour. The rasping footfalls faded, swallowed by the night. Illyra lay trembling in the darkness. The locator beacon clutched to her chest. Survival had always been uncertain here, but now it had taken on a crueler, more visceral edge. She was not alone on this world, and not everything here was content to let her live. Tomorrow she knew wow. Here's Section 4, continuing the story with focused narrative, rich vocabulary, and character-driven momentum within the 1,500-word limit. When Illyra opened her eyes, the world was silent, still and gleaming in the half-light of another eternal morning. She lay half-curled in the hollow of the crevice where she had hidden, body aching with cold and bruises. For a long moment, she didn't move, uncertain if she'd survived or simply passed into some colder afterlife. But the pain was sharp, real. Her breath came in ragged clouds. She was still here. The locator beacon, still clutched in her hand, emitted its quiet, steady pulse. A heartbeat outside of her own, that at least had endured the night. She crawled out from the crevice, scanning the ice around her. No sign of the creature. No fresh tracks. Just snow, freshly drifted and clean, as if the horror of the night before had been swallowed by the glacier's endless appetite for silence. Her suit had held, even under the stress of the pursuit. The alien fur, stitched with her trembling hands, had protected her where human fabrics would have failed. Every seam told the story of survival, of borrowed life stitched together from instinct and luck. And yet, it wouldn't be enough if the creature returned. She needed shelter, not another alcove, something fortified, a place where she could think, plan, regroup. She remembered passing what looked like a cave system carved into the eastern ridge, a mouth in the glacier's belly. It was a risk, but so would stay exposed on the ice. She had no weapons, no allies, and a dwindling window of hope. Movement, always, was her only choice. The journey to the cave was slow and harrowing. Her legs protested with every step. Tendons stretched too far, muscles frayed. But the air seemed calmer today, the wind less hostile, as if even the planet itself had paused to observe her struggle. The cave's entrance loomed ahead like the gate to some ancient cathedral, vast and dark and humming with stillness. Inside, the air was colder but deadened. No wind, no howling across open ice. Just a quiet drip of melting frost and the faint echo of her boots on packed snow. The chamber expanded as she moved inward, revealing long pillars of ice that shimmered with trapped minerals and frozen time. She set up camp beside a thick outcropping of stone, letting her body finally slump into stillness. Her fingers itched with the absence of something to do. For days she had been moving, building, sewing, surviving. Now, faced with enforced pause, she found her mind turning restlessly. She thought of the creature, not the great, hibernating beast that had saved her, but the one that had hunted her, unprovoked, relentless. What was it? A predator native to this world, roused by the changing season? Or something more recent, drawn by the faint warmth of her beacon? Had it once been kin to the slumbering giants, twisted by starvation or exposure? The thought gnawed at her. As night fell again, Alara began sketching rough plans in the snow using a shard of ice. Defensive layouts, simple traps. She had no real tools, but she had knowledge, training, and desperation, humanity's oldest and sharpest edge. If the creature came again, she wouldn't run blindly. She would be ready. She slept in shifts, always half awake, listening for footsteps that never came. Time became abstract, marked only by meals, beacon checks, and the slow erosion of fear into a kind of grim resolve. Then, on what she believed to be the third night in the cave, a sound broke the monotony. A beep, a different one. She jerked upright, fumbling for the beacon. The light was no longer just steady. It was blinking in a rhythm she had only seen in training simulations. Signal locked. A connection had been made. Her hands flew over the beacon's interface, heart pounding as she transmitted a simple message. Survivor located. Request extraction. Coordinates transmitting. Seconds passed. Then came a reply. Response received. Ship in orbit. Extraction ETA. 18 hours. Alara exhaled a sound that might have been a sob. She stood, knees buckling, and let herself laugh. An unsteady, delirious laugh that echoed to the ice halls. After all this time, someone had heard her. Someone was coming. But joy quickly gave way to vigilance. 18 hours was a lifetime here. She set to work immediately. Her cave became a bunker. She rigged her clothing scraps to form a decoy silhouette at the far end of the cavern. She sharpened a broken length of metal from her emergency kit into something approximating a spear. She stacked rocks near the entrance, ready to collapse them if needed. The old terror returned, now sharpened with purpose. It came at dusk. She felt at first a pressure in the air, a wrongness. Then she heard the soft crunch of feet on snow, the slow inhalation of a creature testing the wind. She positioned herself behind a fallen slab of ice, every nerve in her body taut. The creature entered slowly, eyes glowing faintly. It sniffed the decoy first, and when it snarled in realization, Ilara moved. She drove the metal shard into its side as it turned, aiming for the exposed seam between its scales. The creature screamed, high and alien, and lashed out. She was thrown against a cavern wall, pain lancing through her ribs. But the wound had slowed it. It bled thick, dark ichor that hissed against the ice. It lunged again. She rolled, grabbed a stone, and struck wildly. Once, twice. The creature faltered, dazed by pain and confusion. She scrambled upright and drove the shard down again, this time with all her weight. It pierced the eye. The beast collapsed, twitching, then stilled. Ilara fell to her knees beside it, gasping, blood from her lip mixing with the creature's on the ice. She didn't move for a long time. Dawn came with muted light, filtering through the ice ceiling. She rose unsteadily, pain flaring in her side, bruised, cracked, but alive. She wrapped her ribs with strips of fabric and stood outside the cave, watching the horizon. And then, just as promised, the ship descended, sleek, silver, haloed in steam. The ramp hissed open, and uniformed figures poured out, shouting her name, rushing to her aid. One of them took the beacon from her trembling hand. Another draped a thermal blanket over her shoulders. But she barely heard them. Her eyes were fixed on the ice fields beyond, on the distant silhouettes of the great creatures still asleep beneath the snow. "Don't disturb them," she said hoarsely, surprising herself. "They saved me. Leave them be." The medic blinked but nodded, sensing something sacred in her tone. As the ship rose into the sky, the world shrank beneath her. The ice, the beasts, the blood, all faded into a pale mosaic. She sat by the window, wrapped in fur and silence, and watched until the planet curved away from view. She had survived. But more than that, she had learned. Would you like an epilogue or final summary to close the story?